Hello, and welcome to the panel on diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of the 2020 Summit, the dawn of the decade of disruption. First and foremost, thank you so much to Enrique and Rubio for putting this summit on as part of the Hacking HR community. And secondly, thank you so much to our amazing panelists that are here today. They bring decades of experience to this topic, and I'm really excited about the discussion we're about to have. My name is Rebecca Oppenheim, and I will be moderating this panel. Before I jump into intros, I would like to say that anyone that is joining us live, please join in the conversation in the comment section. It's a really wonderful opportunity to talk to each other, and don't forget to ask questions. I will be doing my best to go through them, and we hope to get to some of them at the end of the panel. So I want to just jump right in, and we'll start with introductions. Top center, we have Jenna Etienne. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Grant Thornton and is responsible for developing and implementing their firm-wide diversity and inclusion strategy. She was previously a principal consultant at Etienne Partners and also formerly the president and CEO of the National Association of Black Accountants after working in public accounting for 17 years. Additionally, she's a respected author and speaker on diversity, inclusion, and culture, small firm operations, practice management, and tax ethics. Thanks so much for joining us, Shana.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have next to her, Rebecca Bastian, and she is currently the VP of Community and Culture at Zillow, where she leads the efforts around equity and belonging, social impact, and cultural engagement. She also serves on nonprofit boards as an advisor to technology startups and is a Forbes.com contributor. Rebecca has been recognized in the PSBJ 40 Under 40 and the Female Founders Alliance Champion Awards, and her first book, Blaze Your Own Trail, will be coming out in February 2020. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Next to me is Ephanis Henderson. He is the co-founder of the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion and president and CEO of HenderWorks. Previously, Ephanis served as Chief Diversity Officer for Weyerhaeuser Company, Federal Way, Washington, until his retirement in 2013. And with over 40 years of experience through various HR roles, he is an internationally recognized diversity thought leader and was even named one of the top diversity officers in corporate America by Diversity Best Practices and Working Mother Media, and was also 100 Global Diversity Thought Leaders invited by the President of the Society of Human Resource Management. Welcome, Ephanis.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And finally, we have Rania Anderson. She's an international keynote speaker, author, and executive business coach who transforms the way men and women work together. She is also the author of We, Men, Women, and the Decisive Formula for Winning at Work, as well as Undeterred, the 6 Success Habits of Women in Emerging Economies. Good morning.
It's great to be with everyone.
So I kind of just want to jump right in. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a pretty big topic, and I'd like to start out with finding out why this work matters to you, and really, what do you think of when you hear the word diversity? So why don't we jump it off with Rebecca?
Okay, great. Thank you. I guess to answer your first question about why this matters, it kind of depends on the audience, right? To be perfectly honest, it matters to me because I recognize that there are some pretty huge systems of oppression and systemic inequities in the world that have impacted the lives of, both the people that work at my company, the people I'd like to have work here, and just the people in our communities. And I want to do anything I can to help change those systems. But at the same time, I can certainly make the case for the business case behind this work as well, right? And there's plenty of data and research that shows that having both diversity, which is a broad range of backgrounds and identities in the workforce, is going to lead to better results. And that really focusing on that sense of belonging of our employees is going to free up their mental space to contribute and be more productive and want to stay and thrive in the workplace. So there's both of those reasons.
Yeah, definitely twofold. And Jenna, is there anything you'd like to add to that about why this work, what it means to you?
Yeah, I actually take it really personally. I'm biracial, and I grew up in a world that sees me as only one of the 2 sides of me. My mother's Filipino. And so if I were to walk out in the world and say I'm Filipino, people would think she might need to be checked, Um, and so I think it's really important that we understand and really talk about what identity is to all of us individually. So I echo what Rebecca said, and I think that this is the workforce today. We all want to show up as our authentic selves and as our whole selves. And we all understand now today more than ever, covering isn't something we want to do at work. We want to be ourselves, well, most of ourselves anyway, all day long and not have to be a different version at work. And finding ways to do that is safe and that is encouraging. I think it's really important work. And to me, that's what's behind D&I. Because I think D&I itself is a phrase that has become almost a platitude. People hear it, they think they know what it means, and they move on. But there's so much more work to be done in the space.
Definitely. And what about you, Ephanis? What do you think of when you hear the word diversity, or why is this work important to you?
Well, thank you. I've had a fairly long career in human resources. And currently, let me just highlight some work that I'm doing with ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. I'm part of a global committee that is in the process of developing global standards for diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's a lot of confusion, a lot of differences in terms of how people think about this issue. What we hope to bring is a set of definitions, a set of information and guidelines that can help organizations, from the smallest organization to the largest, understand and appreciate the kinds of things that are involved in this work. It's not just about the right thing to do. It's not just about compliance, but it's really key to competitive advantage in the future. And we want to provide at least a framework for folks to think about this issue in a strategic and systemic way. A lot of folks think about it on an individual to individual level, but it is part of a concentric circle of behavior, of systems and practices, and of leadership. And so for me, it's part of my life work, and I really do think it is an important part of how you do business going forward.
Definitely, I agree. And Rania, what about you?
So I would echo everyone's sentiments, both looking from the corporate, the societal, the individual. I'm originally from the Middle East, and so like Janae, people mistake me for white, and that's not who I am, and so it's very complicated. What I like to do is to flip the question around and ask people, what is the case for the status quo? We're constantly being asked to make the case for why we should have diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity. And I'm tired of always having to make that case, and I like to just flip things around and say, so tell me why we should keep things the way they are today. What's your rationale for that? And really make people begin to think about how we're approaching this whole topic.
That's a really great point. I love that you flip it around like that. It makes you think about the problem in a completely different perspective. So I'd like to just, move on to the next question, which, Jana, I'll have you start with this one. And, we previously spoke about this before, but, there are a lot of companies that are really flaunting their diversity initiatives, and they're saying that they're trying to increase diversity. But as we've seen throughout the years, really, the numbers aren't changing. So what do you think really has to happen in order for real change to occur?
That's a boil the ocean question, but I think that at its core, it's part of it is what Rania just said. One, we need to flip the script. And I think one of the things that I've started saying at work, anyway, so I guess now publicly, is that I might be director for diversity and inclusion, but this isn't my responsibility. It's just my job. And I don't mean that to marginalize or minimize the importance of this work. But what I really want to emphasize is that without leadership, accountability, and ownership, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not moving the needle. If our leaders don't drive this change and own this change, nothing's going to change. So I think that's important. But I also think that we have to frame diversity differently because, as everyone has already mentioned, D&I is so often seen as an HR thing, or it's a people thing. It's about employee management. I listened to the two earlier conversations, and somebody in the first conversation this morning session was talking about how words matter. And I think in the D&I space, this is especially true. I like to frame diversity as something we see, it's something we notice, it's something we count, it's something we measure. In and of itself, it's nothing but data. It's a data point. Versus inclusion is really is two sides. There's what the company says. The company declares that it wants to be inclusive, or they put words on their website like you're referencing that says we are inclusive or we believe in inclusion. Mm. And while fascinating, that's like somebody saying, I'm just the nicest person you've ever met. Well, it doesn't matter. You know, one of the things we say in my family, and we've certainly said this, I have 2 boys. And we used to say this to them when they were growing up, that it doesn't matter. So let's say I'm talking to my sons are Sebastian and Dominic. So I would say Dominic, it doesn't matter what you say to Sebastian. It really only matters what Sebastian hears. And it's important for you to acknowledge what he is saying to you about what he's hearing. And I think that that's something that's missing in our conversation about D&I, that companies can say they want to be inclusive, but if you're not hearing your employees' feedback, and to the panel just before us, employee experience, if you're not acknowledging that either people don't feel included, or they don't feel safe, or they don't feel that they belong, then it doesn't matter what we're doing. And I think that, so to me, I mean, I guess I'm a bit rambly, but I don't have a really good answer because this stuff is so complicated. Diversity and inclusion, yes, it's about people, but it's also about systems, it's about processes. It's something that should be baked into our branding and our communications, both internal and external. It has to be in our leadership development. It's almost like the nervous system in the human body. It touches and affects everything.
It's so interconnected.
Yes, interconnected, but in and of itself, it's really hard to pinpoint. Mm-hmm. You can measure the outputs and the results of it, but you can't necessarily measure the mechanics of it, so to speak.
Definitely. And Rebecca, is there something that, you know, you've seen kind of really move the needle or has been able to make a difference internally at the Zillow Group that you've implemented or really developing?
Yeah, so, you know, the needle that my team is most focused on moving with the help of the entire company is employees' sense of belonging. We've kind of distilled down all of the different kind of areas of focus and inputs into really focusing on what's the one number that's going to be indicative of everything. And, you know, there's certainly, we have diversity recruiting and we look at representation at all levels, of course, but really the cultural movement that we're trying to create, which we believe every employee really needs to be part of, results in both a sense of belonging reported by employees that is high, but that also is consistent across different identities. Because, you know, I think when you don't really focus on culture in a sustainable and meaningful way as it relates to both equitable opportunities to grow and thrive in the company and, you know, a culture where people really have that emotional safety to bring their best selves and to really speak up and contribute, then you're going to see discrepancies across populations. So we've distilled it down to that kind of difference in reported sense of belonging. We ask, we have 2 employee engagement surveys a year, and then we also have an equity and belonging survey each year. So 3 total. So that gives us some really good data points throughout the year. And that's what we're really focusing on. So in terms of, you know, the programs that I think really contribute to moving that needle, we have our affinity networks. That's also referred to as employee resource groups in some places. And, you know, about 40% of our company is participating in those. We have 9 networks at this point. And both the community within identities, but also the community across employees that really want to be allies to different populations, I think that really helps with sense of belonging. We also do a lot around learning pathways. So really meeting everyone where they are in terms of their understanding of how to apply an equity lens to their work and how to create a sense of belonging in our culture. And then we really try to provide the different resources and a lot of different formats for learning and increasing in that journey. And also we rely really heavily on storytelling. So we believe that the more that we're able to create the space for a lot of different experiences to exist and be valid at the same time and for people to understand each other's experiences, then that's going to increase the overall sense of belonging.
And that's how we communicate today, right? Is through stories on social media, TV, websites, whatever it might be. That's how we connect in today's world. And so I think that's such an effective way to communicate, the initiatives that you have going on and the successes that you have and really what makes up your company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, we talk a lot about really needing buy-in from leadership, and both Shana and Rebecca obviously work at companies where there's a lot of buy-in from leadership, right? It's something that they're passionate about, and hence your role and just the commitment. But Rania, what do you think someone can do when they work at a company, they see that this is missing or really needs more attention, and there's not necessarily that buy-in from leadership? Are there still actions that, a manager or leader not on the leadership team or part of that table can take to bring this work to life?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's where I've decided to focus my efforts and what I think is missing in moving the needle. It's really, we've talked a lot about senior executives and their role and the role of the corporation. But what is the role of the individual? And my work really is on engaging every manager and leader throughout the whole organization so that they understand it's not Janai's job, it's their job, right? And the types of actions that I talk about are around, what do you need to eliminate from your workplace? How do you eliminate microaggressions and sexist comments and practices that don't allow certain people to prosper? What are the actions you personally can take in your own team meetings to encourage diverse voices to speak? How do you call on your colleagues? How do you stop people from interrupting? How do you make sure everyone is heard? How do you expand your interactions as a mentor? Are you only mentoring people like you? Are you mentoring people who are not like you? Who are you sponsoring? Are you attending ERG groups where they're not necessarily for your kind of identity, but you're actively being a part of that? So really distilling down individual actions. So regardless of if you don't work for a company that's really gung-ho and focused on this, you can make a difference in your own department. And I'll just say one more thing. I think playing off of what both Rebecca and Janai talked about, it's so complex. It's such a big ocean. And it is like the nervous system. And what I recommend is what Rebecca talked about. Pick some place to start. If you're trying to get healthy and you're not a healthy person, you could look at diet, you could look at sleep, you could look at your level of stress, you could, there's so many millions of things. Choose one, start somewhere. Don't get so confused by it's such a huge project or it's such a huge thing, we can't do anything. Yes, you need to tackle all those things, but start somewhere, make a difference, move the needle in that area, and keep adding on from there as you build your muscles. So
it can be very overwhelming. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, and there's one other thing, Rania, that I would add to what you just said about you. Another frame of another perspective on that is for each of us individually to think, what can I do? Because if my boss is trying to encourage openness or trying to get me to participate or share my thinking, until I'm willing to give it a shot, until I'm willing to trust the process and the conversation, so each of us have some work to do to overcome what is our natural hesitation when you are the other in the room. Because I worked in public accounting my entire professional career, and public accounting today in CPA firms, it's still partners, 77% male and 95% white. So clearly I'm the oddball in the room if I'm not a partner, but were I a partner, I'm an exception. And the people who are the different people tend to be the ones more likely to hold back. And so how do we individually challenge ourselves to overcome that while doing the things that you're talking about? I just think that that's an important aspect to add to
Absolutely.
Individual accountability.
Absolutely. Sorry. And yet I feel like we have put too much onus on the individual and the other. And what I like to talk about is, what are you doing when a woman is leaning in or a person of color is leaning in? What is your what is your individual action? The other person, how are you meeting that person? Sorry, go ahead.
I think Ethna said something to add.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, what I'd like to say is this, as you think about trying to move the dial on diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization, first of all, it depends on you and where you are in the organization. If you're responsible for helping to lead the development of an overall strategy, I think it really has to start with understanding the why. Why is diversity, equity, inclusion, and a sense of belonging important to the organization as a whole? What are the things that this will help? You hear things like innovation, retention, recruitment, satisfaction, but what's the rationale? And I think oftentimes we skip past that. Even some simple things. We've been working with organizations on the definitions. Some organizations haven't taken the time to really talk about, when they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what those concepts mean. And if you don't do that, people talk about it in their own with their own lens and not the lens of the organization. So spending some time to be intentional. So once you've got the framework developed, I think you have to look at it at several levels. And it was mentioned earlier about the individual levels and the relationships with one another in the organization, but it's also institutional processes and practices and systems. And to the extent that they create bias, you need to kind of figure out a way to get through that. But it's really having a framework for change. I think a lot of organizations start to pick at different things, but don't really spend the time thinking about why. Why is it important? What are the pillars of our program and strategy? Things around leadership. What's the role of leadership in terms of setting the tone, modeling the behavior, holding people accountable? What's the role of culture, in terms of how do you invite employees to bring their voice to the workplace and be more representative of who they are? It's about the people management systems, from talent acquisition to development to compensation to learning and development and so forth. As well as looking at the other stakeholders, those who buy your products, those who supply you services. It's really looking at a broader, much more integrated approach. If you're trying to move the needle as a diversity, I call it provocateur or practitioner. And with employees, it's really being willing to step up and provide feedback and helping to create an environment where everyone feels like they have a sense of belonging and so forth. But in my mind, I start with the why. Why is this important? Getting leaders' commitment and buy-in is very important, because a lot of this work requires change, and it's different depending on the company and where you are in your journey. And so, no one way will be right for everyone. You've got to adapt and flex it to meet the needs and the environment and the context in your organization.
FNS, I would say that what you said, equally important in your remarks, is the context of framework, because otherwise it's like whack-a-mole.
Yep.
And if you don't understand what you're doing, Rania, you said pick one thing, but monitor that thing and understand how it is influencing the rest of the D&I ecosystem, or the framework that you talked about, FNS. I think without that, we're going to look up in 5 years and realize we're repeating some things without having seen any change.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. So what's your strategy, right? You have an overall strategy and you decide to focus, this is what's most important to the why here now, and then we're going to add this piece and we're going to measure properly, and we're not going to fool ourselves by the measurements that we make and report on data that's inaccurate about our representation when, it's not at all levels and we're only looking at white women, and et cetera, et cetera.
And probably important too to have the context of, each industry, and not compare yourself to a tech company if you're not a tech company, and set those benchmarks realistically so that you can track your accomplishments? I mean, obviously, you know, we're hearing constantly about the lack of diversity within tech companies. And I spoke yesterday about, you know, Google first reported their split of diversity in ethnicities in 2014. It was, I think, 2.4% were African Americans, and 5 years later, they're at 3.3%. So, you know, it hasn't really been a drastic change, but without the context, you can't really judge that number because you don't really know necessarily, you know, what their initiatives are. And speaking of that, you know, and anyone can kind of jump in here, we hear a lot that it's a pipeline issue, right? This is a term that's thrown out a lot, that we would have more minorities in tech if there were more qualified candidates. And I'd love to hear your take on that, and if it's something that you're working on with the companies you work with or internally, and what your thoughts are.
I'll jump in, and I hear that all the time, and one of the things that I try to share for context, I think that is so important. We as a profession of accountants, public accounting in particular, we can't be more diverse than the students studying accounting. So perhaps we need to think about that. When we think about pipeline, oftentimes the conversations internally in terms of pipeline is the promotion pipeline. So from the moment of hire and the pipeline to get them to partner or principal or managing director. When in fact, the people that we're hiring in are actually more diverse today than they've ever been before. So I think we need to push back on how we're defining success, because the context is we're more diverse today than we were 15 years ago at the lower levels in public accounting. We're still not there at the higher levels in public accounting at the partner level, but that's because 15 and 20 years ago, when the today partners in CPA firms started,
right,
we weren't diverse then.
And the makeup of the U.S. is changing.
Yes.
The youngest generation, actually under 18 by next year, will be minority white, but that will not reach the 60-plus-year-olds until after 2060. So we're seeing it grow up the pipeline.
Exactly. So I think that context is critical, because otherwise we're going to always look at leadership and then go, oh, we're not doing so well. And in fact, we are doing better than we say.
The other thing I would say, too, is that if you look at the work environment and the work systems, it's quite different from what we saw in the 20th century. And so if we're applying approaches that are 20th century approaches to 21st century problems, we're not going to get very far. Just a case and example, if you think about how work is done, the role of artificial intelligence and social media, their impact, and where people are doing the work, and the fact that a lot more work today is in the service industry and information industries. And so the types of work systems and work design approaches are different. And the millennials and the Generation G society, from my point of view, are much more interested in building their skills and capabilities, and not willing to stay at, say, one firm for 20 or 30 years. And so you're going to have more turnover, as people look to build their portfolios, and as organizations reduce the kinds of, I call them golden handcuffs, that you saw in the 20th century in terms of pensions and long-term pay and benefit programs. Those things are impacting how people think about work, and they also are impacting the pipeline for talent. So you may be recruiting individuals, but if you're not creating a sense of belonging and a very inclusive work environment, you're going to find that those people are not going to stay very long.
In addition, I would add, so the earlier pipeline issue that Janae talked about is critically important. In some other fields, it's different, right? And in some fields, right, we can take talent and teach them what we need to teach them, right? Not necessarily in accounting or attorneys, although we have a lot of female attorneys and still not a lot of female partners, but getting organizations to think about the raw talents and aptitudes of people, and how they train people to be successful in their own industry, and looking at talent in a new and a fresh way.
Yeah, I echo that for sure. I think whenever I hear pipeline problem, I think, what is your definition of the pipeline that you're looking at? Because a lot of times the pipeline is, we're looking at, top tier universities, or we're looking at people that have worked at certain companies or with specific job titles, and really looking at transferable skills and what are the really minimum core requirements to be able to do this job versus what can be learned or what can we support, and creating those more equitable opportunities. And then also the promotion pipeline, right? So is it always the people who are moving from a certain background or job into the next one? Is it, are we relying on the people that feel confident to raise their hand and ask for the next opportunity? There's a lot of biases in the different pipelines that we're examining, that we can really widen the pipeline so much by defining what we're looking for in more inclusive ways and by broadening where we're looking.
Definitely. And one stat that I saw recently, Pew Research just did a study, and, so many people have come around now at companies, individuals, even in our neighborhoods. We see the importance of diversity and want that in our life. When it comes to companies and recruiting, because a lot of this does get put, the beginning of the process is talent acquisition and recruiting. It's something like 74% realize that diversity is important and they want it in the workplace, but only about 24% want ethnicity or gender or anything like that to come into play in the decisions in the hiring process. How do you see that gap? Do we need to address that? Is that hindering our progress?
I think that it's really important to have a diverse slate of candidates that we're looking at. And there's plenty of research that shows that when you focus on that you do end up with a lot more diversity. But again, a lot of it kind of comes back to what your criteria is, right? Because as soon as you broaden that, then you're basically allowing a lot more people in the top of the funnel. And then I don't think you have to be setting goals or quotas necessarily, as long as you're really making sure that you're being inclusive and equitable in how you're bringing people into the process.
Yeah, I see. It's interesting. I see the question about goals and quotas. The first thing that pops up into my head is that whole thing about the blind auditions in the orchestra, because women walking in with their shoes, even when it was blind, you knew that it was a woman based on, or you thought you knew it was a woman based on the sound they made walking across the floor. So now they take the shoes off. And I think how far does this have to go? I think quotas or setting minimum requirements and diversity targets are important as a starting point. But we don't have a good history as organizations, as governments, as regulators, in reversing those policies later when they're no longer necessary. I think that it's important to have something that forces us to get outside of our comfort zone. Otherwise, groupthink just persists, because as humans, we're really good at that, and it's part of how our brain functions. I get that. So I do worry. And it's one of those things that I don't know that there's a right answer. It kind of goes back to the things that everyone has already said. Where is your organization in the journey? What are your current priorities when it comes to D&I? What are your current practices? And is there something you're trying to disrupt in your organization? And then take those things into consideration when thinking about whether you need to have these types of things in place in your company or your firm or organization.
I'd like to key off of a word, because words matter, that we've used a couple of times, and the word is journey. And one of the things that I push back on leaders to think about is, you ever talked about a sales journey or a service journey or a safety journey or an operational journey? We're not, we think of this D&I and equity and belonging work like we're on a journey and maybe we can get there, instead of saying, this is our commitment as an organization, and these are the things we're going to be known for, and really setting a stake. I'm not also the same like what we've been talking about for quotas, but what are the goals you can set, and what are the things you are doing as a as a sales organization, you do these things. As a service organization, you do these things. As a diverse, inclusive organization, you do these things, and you're going to do them no matter what, and hold people accountable and measure them on those results.
Yeah, I hope more measurements will come into play as we move forward. And, you know, part of this summit is really looking forward to the future. 2020 obviously is a couple months away, which is crazy to say. But, you know, a couple of things that we've seen, I mean, look at California, for example, speaking of the quota, you know, their law requires now that publicly traded companies have at least one woman on their board of directors by the end of this year, more in the future. It's the first law of this kind. FNS, do you think we're going to see more requirements coming like this to force diversity upon companies? And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things, and that's one of the reasons why we're developing the standards, and they're global standards, and the team that's developing them are from over 11 countries as part of our team. But what we're seeing, and one of the things that I talk about, is that America in particular is becoming a majority-minority society. And if you look at urban centers, most of them have already become that. And so as you look at your license to operate in these communities, increasingly the local officials or diverse city councils, mayors, county commissions, and so forth. And so one of the reasons why organizations have got to pay attention to this, and as you look at millennials and the Gen Z group, they are much more socially conscious and are raising and pushing back on traditional approaches to organizations and organizational development. And again, I agree with the point about this not being a journey. It's really being adaptive to changing conditions and circumstances in community and organizations and so forth. But I do believe that there's going to be an increased pressure brought by government, by advocates and so forth to show that you're representing the communities that you're providing services or products to. And you're seeing that with some of the pressure that some companies are seeing around their services and how they're describing their products. And they're posing questions, tell me more about your diversity and your makeup and so forth. So I don't think this is going to let up. Now, the question that I think is emerging now is the growing polarity in America. I mean, some people are very supportive and forward-looking in these areas, but there is a segment of society, even in our companies, that are pushing back and say, haven't we done enough? Aren't we beyond this? And so you have this creative tension that's occurring. And I think we as diversity practitioners have got to find a way to think about how to work through some of these growing polarities around difference and around diversity and inclusion.
Can I ask a question? Am I allowed?
Please do.
This one's for you, FNS. And it's inspired by, I think, Rebecca, what you were talking about, data. So you're talking about this increased polarity. And one of the struggles that I've experienced, especially talking about, across a lot of D&I professionals, is getting that data. And because we all hide under these privacy laws and whatnot. But the reality is when our employees join our organizations and as long as we have a process to collect that information and keep it safe and not personally identifiable and use it for our own purposes, we should be able to have this data to measure and track progress. So I'm curious if the results of the project you're talking about, FNS, will include recommendations for data distribution and sharing and reporting, benchmarking, goal setting, et cetera, because if we're not careful in this space, I worry that it just becomes another form of EEOC quotaism.
It's not really a management system, which is a requirement. It will come out as a guideline or a should in terms of the standard. But I think you're right. Data is important. And as you look at some of the corporate social responsibility surveys and so forth, they're increasingly asking for this kind of information, not just here in the US, but in Europe and in some respects Australia and other places around the world. So there's going to be increasing pressure to prove and to show what you're doing to support the creation of a more inclusive culture and climate and workforce in your organizations. I don't think we're going to get away from that. And I think to the extent there is data, and they're prescribing in some respects the type of data that they're looking for. They're looking for the composition of your boards. They're looking at the composition of your senior leadership teams, as well as the overall composition of the workforce in particular. And I think some are even getting more sophisticated to ask the question of, tell me about the diversity of diversity, and does your diversity reflect the broad spectrum of differences that we're seeing in our communities and in our countries and so forth. So you're going to see more of that. And I think the fact that we're becoming a majority-minority country and society is going to accelerate that demand.
And it's looking at also at the actual systems, right? The HRIS systems and the applicant tracking systems. Some of them don't have these capabilities. They don't talk to each other. The data is, people who are in roles like you and Rebecca are in are, asking people to run reports, and, it's not just automatically happening. Again, talking about how do we look at sales data and service data? We have all this information and it's just automatically feeding into our systems, and we're generating reports and we're looking at things. And to your point, being able to have that be part of our process.
What I'm hoping is that the conversation eventually starts to flip, similar to the way you phrased asking the question the other way, Ronnie, at the beginning. I hope that as we start sharing data, the initial data that might come out might show us to be, and it's not going to be a surprise, less diverse in leadership. Maybe we have gender parity, but we don't have racial, any form of racial representation in a meaningful way. I don't know. My thought is, and this is just my personal opinion, I'm not speaking for Grant Thornton here, my thought is that as those numbers start getting shared, there might be some negative reaction by clients, by customers, by the media, by the public. And so there's a hesitancy to share that, which is why I think having standards and best practices so that context can be provided will be so valuable, because we can quickly turn that around and turn it into a positive in terms of the progress we're trying to make, or why things are the way they are. It's not as bad as it looks. It's actually better than we expected, and being able to position us as D&I professionals to empower those conversations rather than always hunkering down in this defensive mode. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm saying?
Totally.
I would also add that, sorry, I was just going to say, we're not fooling anyone by keeping the data close. It's not like people are going to see you're not sharing your data and, oh, they must be really on top of it, right? I'll just assume that.
It's speculation, not facts.
Yeah, it's, I think that transparency is so important and it's valued. And no one's, we've started being more brave about the data that we share externally. And it's been, I think people really appreciate that transparency, and it builds trust, and it shows that we're holding ourselves accountable and that we care about this, right? So I don't, it's even when it's not a regulatory or a compliance thing, I think that just making that decision to be really open and transparent about where we are and acknowledging what we're working on, I think is valuable.
I agree with that point wholeheartedly. And when I worked with Weyerhaeuser, one of the things we did was to become much more transparent. One of the things that not sharing the data does, it often allows people not to even look at data or even analyze it, and not to address issues that, if dealt with, could have protected organizations from lawsuits and so forth. And so I think burying your head in the sand and not looking at the information and sharing it, I think sharing it helps you really take on the issues in a timely manner, and help you and help people trust that you're doing the right thing and that your organization is really supportive. So I agree with Rebecca on her point.
That's really a great point. And actually, I'm going to take a couple questions as this kind of starts to come to a close. If anyone has questions in the comment section, please ask them. We had two people actually ask basically the same question earlier, Lauren Sokorakov and Jeevan Sigdel. Sorry if I mispronounced your names. But basically they're wondering, how can we encourage leaders to look at other types of diversity, such as age or ability? Ageism is a real problem today, and it's not necessarily being looped into diversity conversations. So, Rania, why don't you start with this one of, how can we encourage leaders to look at these different forms of diversity?
I'm going to talk about the individual role because I think others on our panel will talk about the corporate role or, the structural role, and both are important. As a manager, you can make that decision to think about diversity on many levels and to ask yourself those questions and to look at your own data and to look around your room and say, okay, what does my team look like? Do I have older people, younger people, disabled, people of color, women, etc.? And to just have that awareness and to talk to your HR people or to your leaders about, hey, when I look at the makeup of my own team, I see that we are not represented in these areas, and I want to make a commitment to change that. And how do I go about doing that? So I'm just taking this very narrow slice, but it's the work that I do, and to really show people that we don't have to think about it on such a macro level. We can also think about it on a micro level.
I'd just like to add to that that's part of having a framework, and in the framework, particularly around things like workforce representation and of various demographic groups, what you do is zone in on the areas where you have the most significant underutilization, and really target your resources in trying to close the gap in those areas of pronounced difference or gaps. And so I would argue that the framing or looking at it in a broader sense helps you then go to those areas where you have an opportunity to make a significant difference. I think the thing that people often try to do is to try to take it all on, but I think your point is that really part of it is really where do you focus your limited resources, the time and attention. Maybe it's something that you take on each year. You say in 2020, this area is the area that we really want to focus on. We're going to focus on the other areas, but this one is an area where we have a unique opportunity because we're woefully underutilized in that area. But the other part of it is the issue of opportunity, when you have opportunities to hire, because oftentimes you may not have opportunities to hire. So it's looking at your placement rates, introducing concepts like the Rooney Rule and the Mansfield Rule to help at least require people to ensure that they've got a diverse pool of candidates to review and select from.
Yeah, I think that the points that you make about representation are important. My concern is that representation without engagement is merely that. So, if you look at your team and your team is diverse, but you're not seeing any different types of thinking coming up, is that a reflection of you as a leader? Is it a reflection of culture, a lack of safety, a lack of trust? What is that? And how do you dig deeper into that? Then I would swing the entire opposite direction, though. And I would say that one of the things that I've been talking about lately is imagining a room with 100 men in that room. And all of those men are white. I challenge you to think that there's diversity in that space. And that's what I mean about looking more broadly at diversity. If I was in that room, so it was me and 99 white guys, people would look at me and say, oh, there's the diversity. No. We're looking too narrowly at it. There's diversity of style, background, experience, process, methodology, client service lines in the case of public accounting. And if we can challenge our thinking about how we approach diversity from that perspective holistically, and that goes to the extreme opposite of where you started, Ronnie, I think that there's opportunities to work at this from both sides, if that makes sense.
So you're talking more about internal diversity rather than labeling people from external factors.
Well, just because our diversity language has historically been based in the EEO model of race, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ status, veterans, or disabilities. And we've got to get broader than that when we think about diversity, because even the people that you look around the room and you think it's a room of all white people, or a room of all black people, or all Hispanic people, you're probably wrong.
I think the only counter I would say to that is that in the communities, in the areas that your organization is in, if some of the more visible forms of diversity are not represented in the organization, i.e. race, gender, people with disabilities, veterans, I think you're going to get challenged from your stakeholders outside the organization, and I think you want to pay attention to both. I don't want to dismiss what you're saying, but I think there are two levels of this, and to the extent your organization does not reflect the communities, the customers, and so forth in those areas that you're serving, I think you're setting yourself up for challenges from investors, from government officials, and so forth.
Future employees.
And future employees,
Table
exactly.
stakes, to your point. I totally agree. That's it.
And Rebecca, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Stefanos on that and won't go too deep of a rat hole on the, the diversity of thought piece. But I was just going to mention back to the question around how we support, a lot of different forms of diversity. And I think that the original asker was referencing age as one of them. With back to our affinity networks, and we have 9 of them, and one of them is about employees over 40. But really, I think that framework is really powerful. Each network has an executive sponsor. Each network has an HR business partner liaison, and they really have the voice of their members. And so, again, it's not relying on, a single person or team to really understand every need and drive all that work, but really enabling employees to be empowered to really drive the work and the results that's important to the populations that they're representing, and creating the framework to support that. And so that's a way of really scaling and making sure that we're meeting the needs of a lot of different populations.
I'd like to just go back for 1 second to what Janai was talking about and the diversity of thought. And the reason, there's so many valid things, we could talk about this forever. When we think about it in that way, then we don't blame and shame people who are male and white and leave them out of the conversation, right? It's a way to make people feel part of the solution and to get them to recognize that they have been working in a diverse environment, not as diverse as we want, certainly have a long ways to go, but it is a different way. And I think that's part of why we are going all the way, Rebecca, back to the beginning, your first question, why aren't we making progress? We've been in these rooms talking about this stuff and leaving out people.
There's exclusion happening in this inclusion work.
And the only way to make change is when all of us are part of the solution.
I completely agree. And actually, on that note, it's nice you wrapped it right back up to the beginning. But this was a really wonderful discussion. I hope that people enjoyed watching it and gained value from it about how to be, individually more of an inclusive leader, how we can get leadership on board and things that we can do to really build the plans that we need to start making change within our organizations and our communities. So thank you again, Enrique, for hosting this. Thank you to all of our panelists. If people are enjoying the summit, the last panel is going to be up at 12:45 Eastern. It's called Leading Organizations in the Future of Work. So be sure to go to Enrique's LinkedIn profile and click that link. And it was wonderful. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to be with all of you.